As mentioned, my name is Thomas Berg. I'm a senior product manager here with SailPoint. I've got over 23 years of experience in the identity and access management space, and I'm proud to be here today to talk to you about workflows. We'll go through a quick intro and roadmap. The agenda today, we're going to start with a quick intro to workflows, followed by a timeline to date, and then venture into 2023 roadmap for workflows and beyond. So first of all, what are SaaS workflows? When we say workflows, what we're really talking about is applying security and governance to automation. Workflows at its core is just an orchestration process that's initiated by some triggering event or change, consists of actions and choices based on the data or events within the data flow. IdentityNow already has the capability to automate tasks such as lifecycle management and access provisioning, but these tasks are typically focused on clearly defined inputs. Workflows exponentially increases your value add by enabling the automation of tasks that are not as clearly definable. Tasks that require additional inputs, logic, external integrations, and more. Workflows are a linchpin in building out your autonomous IAM solution. So why SaaS workflows? We know that automation is key to scaling identity security. SaaS workflows exponentially increases your ability to automate tasks that require flexibility of additional logic inputs or parsing of complex calculations. SaaS workflows actually help organizations drive towards scalable autonomous identity security as well. Focusing on the first one, reducing costs. Obviously, manual tasks are pretty expensive. In 2020, one of the major analyst firms actually investigated the return on investment for automating manual tasks specific to identity and access management. This analysis was done by surveying a variety of IAM customers across a large swath of industry verticals and assessing the value based on time and cost of IT admins. Their analysis found that conservatively, automation of manual tasks produced qualified benefits with risk-adjusted present value of $10 million in the first 3 years alone. This included such benefits as moving to event changed micro-certifications, access tasks and license cost reductions, just to name a few. An unstated benefit of this was also the ability to focus the IT teams on improving and tackling high-risk IAM tasks. Obviously, removing costly licenses is another benefit here. From a risk perspective, removing the human factor inherently reduces risk. If you take away the decision-making process from those and apply a logic-based approach to reducing the human factor integration with that, you are actually reducing risk within there. You can also, again, as mentioned before, refocus your IT to high-risk items, and you can eliminate rubber stamping. We talked about before with the micro-certifications. Instead of rubber stamping these large certification campaigns, you can do event-based certification campaigns where you pick up on the event change and actually initiate a certification campaign at that point. Also, the remediation of outliers with the integration of data intelligence, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Another key benefit here is reducing friction. The more you can automate the onboarding tasks, the more you can ensure that your employees and contractors are able to hit the ground running and do their work from day one. As mentioned in a couple of previous statements here, you can simplify the reviews and certification. Instead of reviewing all access, you can review change-based access or micro-certifications. You can also integrate with non-managed applications such as ITSM tools and more. This includes like ServiceNow, Remedy, those types of tools, or even integrating direct API calls. The goal here is autonomous identity security. Flexible automation combined with AI is key to achieving autonomous identity security, and automation is at the core of that. So let's move into talking about the workflow components real quick. This is a brief view of our architecture, and you can see at the top here, this is a workflow service group. Workflow service group basically consists of 3 different. You've got the config service, which is basically the CRUD operations. This is how you create, manage, update, delete the types of workflows that you create. Its primary purpose is to manage those definitions for the tenant with validation logic that verifies the workflow definitions syntactically and semantically. The workflow config service manages the subscriptions and filtering on triggers. which provide the initial input to the workflow, and we'll talk about in just a moment. The service is also responsible for managing the workflow definition lifecycle, things like version control, enabling, disabling the workflow, those types of things. Second component here is the workflow engine. The engine is actually responsible for the execution of the workflow definitions. The engine contains an interpreter that walks the workflow and executes the instructions provided within the workflow, and we'll talk in more detail about that. This service is mostly a headless cluster that handles events from Kafka topics, but it also supports a couple of endpoints where you can retrieve execution history and metrics for prior executions. And then finally, the temporal.io component, or the temporal worker component, is a resiliency layer for the microservice orchestration. So triggers, workflow triggers. Triggers are really kind of the main ingestion point into a workflow, and they determine how and when a workflow is going to be initiated, wake up, and start processing the steps or operators within a workflow. As you can see here, all workflows must have at least one trigger, as that defines how a workflow starts and data that goes into the workflow. The different types of triggers can include external triggers where you're calling an API, for example, to wake up and initiate a workflow. You can have a scheduled trigger where it's scheduled based on either a cron or a UI UX capability that's similar to cron that defines when a workflow should run. Or the most commonly used types of triggers are event-based. These are real-time event-based where we, again, listen to the ETS service and detect certain types of events to wake up, consume that data that's in the trigger to process as we go through the workflow. Some examples of triggers include identity changes, provisioning changes, again, scheduled and external as well. Expanding on triggers a little bit here, as mentioned in the prior slide, real-time event triggers can be an external trigger, as we talked about, or an ETS trigger. ETS, or event trigger service, is effectively a stream of event triggers and are the result of any activity performed within a service. The workflow's registry regularly scrapes ETS and dynamically populates the trigger options in your workflow builder. There are two types, primary types of ETS triggers: fire and forget, and request and response. As you can guess, fire and forget are one-way communication to subscribers. Their sole purpose is to forward the event and event data to the subscribing services, which can include workflows. Most workflows triggers today are fire and forget type. However, this will change once we bring in forms or custom forms, which allows for more direct interaction with the request and response triggers. Request and response type triggers, again, as expected, require or have an expectation of a response or a two-way communication between the services. So by way of example, if you have a request response trigger, such as the dynamic approval type trigger, it's looking for response data back to go back on the Kafka stream. Examples of fire and forget trigger are identity created, identity deleted, provisioning completed, aggregation completed, campaign activated. Examples of request response, again, include dynamic approval or access request pre-approval, post-approval, those types of triggers. Operators are basically choice steps. They basically enable you to branch the workflow based off the unique data that's in the data flow. They provide the flexibility of comparing data that's in the data flow and making choices based off that to branch down a different choice step within the workflow itself. Just like triggers, every workflow must have at least one operator. Typically, this can be just the end step, or it can be a comparator operator with it. You'll notice the note comment there. We do add support, and I'll talk through it in just a moment, about more complex operations in these comparator streams, including the and, or not comparator strings within here. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about that. Some example of operators include looping, which we introduced in the end of Q3, Q4, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. But comparing strings, comparing numbers, and then obviously how you exit a workflow, which include the end step, success or failure within that. So again, expanding on what we talked about in the previous slide, workflows does support the capability to add more complex operators with comparing values in the comparator step. This includes the and, or not capability. Here's an example, by the way, of JSON code for an AND operation where we're comparing the variable A value 1 to make sure that it's equal to 1 in this case, and variable 2 or variable A value 2 is equal to 2. These types of operations, as mentioned before, are available in the backend code. These are considered more advanced operations. Currently, you have to modify the JSON value to get to these in the comparators themselves, and this is an example of the code that you would add for that, for the AND, OR, and NOT examples. However, we are working on a UI UX component to add more complex operators in the future. Again, here's an example of an OR. This would be an example of the exact code that you would add into the choice list or the comparator to add OR capabilities, and then also NOT capabilities as well. Again, the UI was built to support most operations, but we are working on capabilities to add more complex operators for AND, OR, and NOT value comparisons in the future. Okay. Actions are the real meat of the workflow and are the core building blocks you'll use to initiate operations based on the flow data that exists in the workflow. Examples include notifications, whether it's email, Slack, or Teams, creating certification campaigns, managing accounts or access, integrating with non-managed applications such as ITSM tools, and more. Just as expected with triggers and operators, every workflow must have at least one action. Each one of those actions can interact with the data in the data flow. The workflows are built on an additive data flow model, meaning that as you add actions, you are adding data to the data flow of the workflow, and you can access that data in further actions along the way. Each action has its own specific configuration. The dedicated actions have their own specific configuration for the types of actions that are being executed. And we do have examples of generic actions as well, such as the HTTP request action that allow you to leverage any API. Obviously, that requires a little bit more work because you need to know the API and the inputs that go for that. Some examples of the actions, again, include manage accounts, manage access, send email, send Slack. We have a dedicated ServiceNow action that will allow you to create a ServiceNow ticket, manage the ticket, or get information about the ticket. And we're constantly building on our capabilities to add more dedicated actions, which simplify the configuration. Okay. I'll take questions at the end here, so I'm just going to kind of go through this really quickly. But if you have questions, just feel free. You can ask me. Let's talk a little bit about the timeline. So with workflows, many of you may already know that we initiated somewhat of a beta process. In that beta process, we had an open beta that continued through Q1 of 2022. We made a significant pivot in Q1 to refocus our efforts not just on the capabilities that exist within the workflows, but also the usability. Our goal was to make workflows a tool that pretty much any admin can come in and use. Prior focus required a deep knowledge of JSON path. Basically, you had to create the JSON file and upload that to create the workflow. Through our beta process, we learned pretty quickly that customers just weren't adept enough at JSON, or there wasn't deep enough knowledge of JSON path to understand how to create that. So we pivoted our efforts to focus not just on usability or capabilities on the back end, but also on the front end capabilities so that you have a low code to no code type builder to build out these workflows. In Q2, we closed the open beta and we continued on to what we called a closed beta or closed preview. This was a dedicated set of customers where we were looking to get good feedback on their production environments, where they were enabling workflows in production for us to gain feedback on not only the capabilities and the expectations around usability, but also the use cases that they were looking to solve. The goal for GA was really to try and deliver a set of capabilities that was focused on joiner, mover, leaver scenarios, and then expand into additional capabilities later on. The closed beta was very productive in this case, and we were able to progress to GA as of July 1st in 2022, where again, we released this GA component that had basic JML capabilities, basic notifications, and all the actions that you would expect in terms of automation within the IDN tool today. Moving into Q3, we wanted to really kind of focus on expanding past the JML capabilities into other capabilities such as aggregation events, data intelligence integration, and then also improving the usability capabilities. One of those things was to add the capability for templates. Templates were just a means of allowing users to look at a flow that was already built out for them and then expand on it by either accepting it as is or changing the configuration parameters for that to your specific business needs. We also improved the test workflow by allowing some additional capabilities that we'll talk through in just a moment. We added trigger filtering. So instead of firing on every event in ATS, we added the ability for you to filter down to a specific set of events that you were looking to trigger the workflow off. We also have trigger improvements, such as a UI capability for the scheduled, which was previously just a command stream, and added additional triggers as well. We expanded the templates to include some additional templates that we'll talk a little bit more depth in just a moment. And we added additional action and operator improvement. A big improvement was also the support for custom schema within the variable selector within the workflow UI UX. Q4 was really primarily focused on shoring up backend capabilities and learnings that we took through GA to present to improve that performance and reliability. We also added in some really big capabilities, including looping, inline variables. We added Slack action and a dedicated ServiceNow action to leverage those capabilities. Again, those dedicated actions could be performed with the generic HTTP request action. We focused on providing dedicated actions where customers were using these types of actions in a lot of workflows. So it just kind of simplifies the process, makes it easier for you to leverage those types of actions with it. So let's expand into some of these capabilities. As mentioned in Q3, we added the capability for templates. The intent of templates was giving customers a guide to follow for specific use cases. As you can see from the screen print, there are three main ways to build a new workflow. You can select from a list of pre-built templates. You can use the workflow builder, which is a UI-focused, no-code, low-code tool with drag and drop capabilities and dedicated configurations for the actions. Or you can build your own JSON and go crazy with the JSON path capabilities that exist on the back end and then load that file. For templates, our first set of templates, again, we're focused on the JML or joiner, mover, leaver scenarios, where by way of example, in an onboarding scenario, you may have to send notifications to the identity being onboarded or their manager or to HR representatives, movers, where maybe you want to temporarily add back access so that the user can transition into a new role more effectively, or leaver scenarios where you need to make sure that all access is cleaned up, the accounts are disabled, and any certification campaigns are completed within there to make sure that the access was removed appropriately. Following Q3, we actually integrated with some other products to build some additional templates, including 3 for outlier detection, where we can, with integration with the data intelligence team, see where there is outliers detected. And based off the score of that outlier or the risk that's associated, we can take specific actions. So if the access is an outlier score of medium to low, we can just send a notification to the manager saying, hey, you might want to review this access. Medium to high, you might want to go through and temporarily suspend the account and initiate a certification campaign. Or if it's high or high risk, you may want to actually disable the account, initiate a certification campaign, and send notifications so that the user can user risk is eliminated in that case. We also included a SaaS management template, which leverages our SaaS management tool, where it's doing a report, essentially finding access that's not been used. The goal of these templates were essentially to reduce the high license costs for some of these applications. So say, for example, if somebody was automatically provisioned to Salesforce, licensing costs would be pretty expensive. The SaaS management tool generate a report and pass in examples in that report of identities that had access that have not accessed the application in 30, 60, 90 days. Where in 30 days, you may want to just send a notification. 60 days, you might want to initiate a certification campaign. And in 90 days, you may want to actually disable that account. So you're reducing those license costs within it. Again, it's all about trying to increase the adoption of workflows, increase the capabilities within there. As mentioned before, we increased our testing improvements as well. We wanted to make it easier to test, track where in a workflow you were as you're going through that. These testing improvements included the check mark that you can kind of see on the screen here that tells you where you are in the workflow process, but also capabilities to the workflow input and output, and abilities to find an identity to actually search on. Again, trigger filtering improvements included the capability, as you can see on the far left side here, where you can actually filter down. And the outlier detection example we gave before for the templates, this includes the scoring for that, right? So this would be the case of, I only want to trigger this workflow if the risk is high, in this case, 0.9 or above. And if it is that case, follow a specific path for the workflow in that case. For the scheduled trigger, we added a more GUI approach to the cron string, where you can select the frequency that the workflow is going to wake up and initiate. And then for some of the other triggers like identity created, identity attributes changed, we just added the capability for a UI drop-down capability to find the specific attribute that you want to trigger on. A big ask was the custom schema enhancement we did in Q3. And this basically looked at the identity cube and finds all schema so that you can select that in the UI UX workflow builder, and you can reference that data. It doesn't matter if it's a custom attribute you've created on your own or even extended attributes within the system. You now have the capability to actually select those attributes in the UI and UX. Then some additional improvements included improved operator functions, improved action capabilities, including net new actions, and then performance improvements on the back end to ensure reliability and performance and scalability. In Q4, we added another big rock, which was we've called inline variables. This was a big addition to help solve for the dynamic nature of data within workflow, data flow. Most fields in the workflow steps and actions require you to enter a static value or a static field that would be used within there. So by way of example, within a recipient email address, you had to specify a certain person, or you could pass in a specific set of data fields within there. With the addition of inline variables, you now have the ability to reference that data that exists in the prior data flow so that the dynamic nature of the workflow can populate that information more responsibly. Another big improvement in Q4 was looping. For certain actions where there's a large number of result sets, like get access, get counts, list of identities, or even external actions, where the data is sent from an external source, customers needed the ability to apply logic and flow, or think of this in terms of like a child workflow, to iterate through each one of those data sets or the items in an array or list of data. Looping solves this problem by allowing you to define data flows and actions based on the uniqueness of each item passed into the loop. Think of it again as like a child workflow where you're initiating different logic and steps based off of the uniqueness of that data that's passed into the loop. So let's talk about what's next. Again, just calling out a specific note here. The following is our anticipated roadmap. Some of these items are already in progress and will be delivered on time. Some of the items haven't been initiated yet as we start talking about the second half of 2023. Just to call out here that all roadmap items and timelines are subject to change. Starting with Q1, and we'll go into a little bit more in depth in some of these items. But Q1, we're focusing on adding context for loops, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment. We're also adding dynamic variables. Dynamic variables is going in two phases, phase 1 in Q1 and phase 2 in Q2. We're adding the capability to support custom forms or custom data input within the forms. And we're also adding extended execution logging, simulated testing. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about each one of these. In Q2, as I mentioned before, we'll complete the dynamic variables. This is phase 2 of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. We're adding or going to focus on workflows versioning. This is where you can add additional versions. We're going to continue with the forms capabilities, including the ability to trigger on a form submission and just additional fields and capability improvements to the forms. We're going to be adding additional simulated testing, and I'll expand on what that means. And then we're always focused on adding new actions. And these are just a couple of actions that are under consideration at this point. Again, we try to focus dedicated actions on actions that a lot of customers are using. Again, just to simplify the process, we can add that dedicated configuration screen. It makes it easier for you to leverage these types of capabilities instead of using the generic request action. In Q3, our big rocks are going to include starting the work for dynamic approvals. This is an approval step within the workflow. You can add dynamic nature to determining who that approval should go to, the types of approvals, whether it's single step, multi-step, or quorum-based approvals, and routing those to the appropriate persons based off the dynamic nature of a workflow. We're going to continue our forms integration and improve that capability. We will continue to add cross-product workflows for the entire IDN suite. This can include potentially sex data integrations, CAM integrations, KIM integrations within there. We're always looking to add additional capabilities and then expand those to templates. Some of the template improvements we're looking to do includes more of a categorization on that screen, but also adding out-of-the-box templates that you can use to leverage for specific use cases. In Q3, we're going to start the work for task reassignment as well. As I believe many of you should know from prior sessions here, some of the work reassignment stuff that's been done by other teams, we'll take advantage of that and support some of the capabilities for that in the dynamic nature of workflows as well. Q4 and beyond, we'll continue the work on dynamic approvals. This is a phased approach again, just like we did with the dynamic variables, where we'll take some of those capabilities and expand on them as we move forward. Task reassignment continued. We'll continue to do connectivity integrations, and we're always looking to expand into our data intelligence integrations. Obviously, there is this concept of autonomous IAM, where workflows and automation plays a key part in that. So expanding on this a little bit, in Q1, this work is already done. We've added loop context. The loop operator currently takes input from the action immediately prior to. So in this one, you would see a list of identities. The only data that's available in that loop to iterate on was that get list of identities. So you can't reference other data that was in the data prior to the flow. This quarter, we actually introduced what's called looping context, where you can reference other data and make that available in steps within the loop. So by way of example, send email to the user, you can reference information where you've got that identity or that email address from a prior step in the workflow. Execution logging. As mentioned earlier, we use temporal I/O as a resiliency and orchestration layer in workflows. One piece of that is managing the execution logging. Temporal I/O limits persistence of these logs to 48 hours, which presented problems for customers that needed to go back and troubleshoot a workflow execution that failed prior than 48 hours. We've now persisted that to 90 days for short-term rehydrating and even longer for storage. It's important to note here that audit is separate from workflow executions. Audit data is persistent just like all their other services in IDN. We've already completed the enhancement for the backend where the logging is persistent to 90 days. And by the end of the quarter or by the end of this month, we'll have the capability to, as you see here, also filter and sort on those, including pagination for the execution logs. Simulated testing, what we want to do here, the main goal of this is when you're testing a workflow, those actions are actually executed against an identity. In the past, we recommended creating a dummy identity to test the workflow against. In the future, we'll have the capability to simulate those actions where you can toggle on or off the action when you're testing the workflow. And then we'll have dummy data that will provide the test input and output that would be associated with that. First focus is on the framework and a manage access action. And then in Q2 and beyond, we'll continue to extend that to additional actions. Q1, as I mentioned before, we're building on the ability to define and reference data and variables. In this quarter, we started the framework capabilities to add dynamic variables. This includes a capability, by way of example, to actually take string input from a specific attribute. Like, let's say, for example, if you want to create a custom variable where you need to concatenate data, you can define a variable name, you add the data operator that you want to look at, like, for example, first name, where you only want to take the first letter of the first name, so substring, and then combine that with maybe some specific text or even another value within there where you want to take, for example, in this example, we're building out j.smith. You could also append values like at domain, that type of capability. The first focus for dynamic variables is on string values. And as we move into Q2, we'll get more to this goal UI UX experience, and then also expand to date operators. An example of that is where you want to create a certification campaign and notify the owner via Slack that the certification is going to expire in today's date plus 30 days, or it did expire today's date minus X days, those types of operations within work. Again, in Q1, we focused on forms. We're actually extending to a closed preview or closed beta where we have a dedicated set of customers beginning at the end of this quarter. And really, this capability is in adding a custom form where you can take human input data or even dynamically generated data and add that to the data flow of the workflow. You'll notice in here, one example that we're talking about is a form action, where you can define who the form is being sent to, what the form is, and any form input that needs to be provided for that. So the use case here would be a laptop on an onboarding scenario, where depending on the department, the users have different hardware requirements that they can expand into with those different types of laptops based off of the different types of data that's in. Again, this just expands exponentially the capabilities for supporting different types of workflows. Versioning is just the ability to track changes to the workflows and then restore to known good versions. And then some additional actions that we're considering within here for dedicated actions, including potentially a generic HTTP type action for referencing internal SailPoint APIs. Future workflows in IAM is autonomous IAM. Zero Trust practice is built on a foundation of identity and access management, and autonomous IAM is built on a process that requires automation of these tasks within here. Our goal is to, and the future is really wide open for automating a lot of the tasks in your environment. As always, we are looking to improve the product, not just for usability, but also capabilities. There are several ways you can provide feedback. Within the product itself, there's a provide feedback link that allows you to rate the product on usability and extensibility, as well as provide open feedback. And as you see here in the QR code, you can actually use that to scan and schedule a one-on-one session with myself to make sure that we're talking through use cases in the future. You can also go through the developer community and or SailPoint Compass ideas, just like other products within the product. Again, your feedback here is of crucial importance to us. We want to make sure that we're constantly improving and adding capabilities and usability. So please take advantage of this. Please schedule sessions. My time is open to you to make sure that we're listening to you and providing that feedback. With that, I just wanted to say thank you for your time today. I hope you're as excited as I am about workflows. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.